This is the first lecture then in the Frank David Morning Lecture Series of 2024. These lectures run every year on a different topic, as again some of you will know this. They were established in 1989 by F.M. Kirby, the F.M. Kirby Foundation in honour of Frank Davis, a critic at Country Life magazine. I'm Gavin Parkinson. I'm one of the lecturers at Courtauld and the organiser of this year's series, A Century of Surrealism. I want to thank, first of all, the Director and the Dean for Research at the Courtauld, who gave their initial backing to this idea for a series on surrealism. And also to the really exceptional team at the Courtauld Research Forum for their advice, support and organisational skills from the beginning in June or July when we decided to do these right up to today. So Leila, Diego and Grace, very grateful for the support they've given me throughout this process and for the speakers as well. So I'm just going to say a brief word about the series and then a brief word about our speaker today. So the centenary, I mean, many of you will know about there's a centenary taking place this year, the centenary of surrealism. It's 100 years this year since the publication of the Manifesto of Surrealism. And I'm very pleased to say that today is actually the 15th of October. It's the very day that the manifesto was published, so it's 100 years to the day. Thanks to the Research Forum for coordinating it so that we can have the very first chosen one here, the very first speaker on the day of the publication of the manifesto. Now the lectures are not going to be specifically about the manifesto because that would have made them very limited. So we fished out this quotation from towards the end by André Breton. Surrealism, such as I can see of it, asserts our complete nonconformism clearly enough. So nonconformism, resistance, those are the themes that we're using for the manifesto to give what I think is a kind of a long history of surrealism. So not just to do the 1920s or 1930s, but to do with the 20s and 30s of the manifesto and the 1930s right up to the present day, actually. So the first one I'm going to mention him in a minute, but the second one will be on the 5th of November by Fabrice Flacoutez at the Université Jean Monnet at Saint-Étienne. We'll be speaking about the Chilean artist Roberto Matta, who joined the Surrealist group in the 1930s and then left in the 1940s and rejoined at the end of the 1950s. The nature of his use of matter in actual matter material in his work, a political statement. On the 19th of November, Alice Moran of the University of Cambridge, former Courtauld PhD, will be speaking about the very equivocal cloth sculptures by Dorothea Tanning from the late 1960s through the 1970s, I think. And, the 3rd of December, our fourth speaker is Patricia Almer from the University of Edinburgh, speaking about the Berlin artist Unique Zorn, emphasizing trauma and resistance in her paper. And then finally, on the 10th of December, Abigail Souza from Willamette University, Oregon, we'll be talking about the journal Race Traitor, a journal that began in the United States in 1992 and expired some years ago, but there are still kind of ramifications that the journal had in contemporary thought, and she'll be speaking up to the 1990s, up to the present day, actually, her paper goes. So this is what I mean by long history of surrealism from the 20s, 30s, right up to the present day, and that is oriented towards current research, current scholarship on the surrealist movement, which is much more concerned with the 1950s and onwards than it had been 20, 25 years ago. So the format of these lectures is a 50-minute lecture, 50 minutes or so, and there'll be questions afterwards from you, Christoph, today, and after we give the lectures. So I think there'll be about 15 or 20 minutes or something like that. We're not sure, but something like that. The questions will go on for. Then there'll be drinks in the Research Forum seminar room, which is down the corridor on the left afterwards. So, Christoph Fiedler-Kowski, work I've known since at least the 1980s and late 80s, early 1990s when I knew him as a translator. This is before I got to know him as a person. I knew him as a translator and an editor and a writer of very important books. One of the main ways in which we have understood surrealism today is through Christoph's really extraordinary and really important service really to surrealism studies. And notable books by Christoph in Surrealism and Photography in Czechoslovakia, is joint author of. The joint authors are here today, actually, is what I should say. Ian Walker and Michael Richardson are here today. Joint editor of Surrealism Key Concepts in 2016, and it was on the editorial board of the International Encyclopedia of Surrealism, which is everybody's main resource now, reference source, came out in 2019. He was a contributor to museum catalogues for the V&A, for the Design Museum, Tate Modern, and for the Centre Pompidou, and for various museum advisory panels. He is the joint series editor of Bloomsbury's Transnational Surrealism book series, and he is currently working on a project, Documentary Surrealism, funded by the Swedish Research Council with Christopher Nagy. I should also say he's been a great friend to the Institute over the years. Well, any excuse to get Christoph here, and we'll take it. He's was our external examiner for, was it 3 or 4 years? 4 years. And also he's worked on my courses, my BA and MA students, and also on Colin's courses as well. So, Christoph, welcome back.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gavin. And my gratitude to you and the team here at the Courtauld for inviting me to speak this evening. So as we've just heard, this very day, the 15th of October, is the centenary of the most significant date in the history of the Surrealist movement, the publication of Henri Breton's first manifesto of Surrealism. Exactly 100 years later, it's no small responsibility to take this moment to open a series of public lectures exploring the rich ideas and histories of international Surrealism. Particularly given that my focus today is quickly going to move away from Paris in 1924 to explore a far less familiar set of examples and narratives, in considering how the perspectives of surrealist documentary photography could be a way to grasp the context and challenges of surrealism in Czechoslovakia from the 1930s to the late 1950s and beyond. I hope it's going to be a case study of how, once germinated in a different soil, surrealism's thoughts not only develops in highly distinctive ways, but might also do so in the least auspicious of circumstances. As a founding statement of this far-reaching cultural and philosophical movement, Breton's manifesto pinpoints the heart of surrealism's identity as its participants formalised their research and experiments of the previous 5 years. A complete revision of social, cultural and ethical values in order to rebalance humanity's lost place in the world. The rejection of the bankrupt values of rationalism and logic, and an opening to the liberating realms of childhood, dream, the marvellous and the imagination. Above all, in the unlocking of suppressed psychic states through the expression of automatic creative practices. I believe, Breton wrote famously, in the future resolution of these two states, dream and reality, which are seemingly so contradictory, into a kind of absolute reality, a surreality, if one may so speak. And I guess one of the hallmarks, I think, of what I'm going to show you today, and that perhaps for some of you will be quite unfamiliar, will, I think, be to slightly redress the balance back in favour of the reality part of that dialectic. If there were key ideas that hadn't yet been broached by the manifesto, notably the rich contribution of the visual arts to the movement, which here so far were relegated to just a footnote, and its participants' growing political awareness and activism, these would soon be explored in the French Surrealist group's next major publication, the journal La Révolution Surrealiste, whose first issue hit the shelves just a few short weeks later, on December the 1st. So between the manifesto and La Révolution Surrealiste, one might argue the whole history and trajectory of surrealism seemed launched and circumscribed along a narrative arc that many of you will know very well. Except that, in fact, the first journal with a claim to broadcasting surrealism came not from Paris, but from Belgrade. Surrealism, first published on the 21st of November by a group of Serbian poets who had already been mingling with their French counterparts in Paris over the previous months, translating their works, and above all, thinking these works through within their own cultural and political contexts. Surrealism then has in effect always been international, even if the histories of the movement that have, until fairly recently, dominated an understanding of its development, almost always choose to set this story in Paris, seeing the blossoming of international groups from the late 1920s onwards as either an echo or perhaps a linear continuation of French surrealism's ideas. This is a centre and periphery model that tends to obscure the way in which these international groups emerge from their own local research to encounter surrealism as an intuitive, spontaneous unfolding of their discoveries of Breton's circle, rather than adopting it as an off-the-peg package deal. From the viewpoint of Paris, on the other hand, such international perspectives were also an ethical affair. Much as French surrealists expressed their disgust with the spirit of nationalism, in counterpoint they made their movement international, networks to overseas circles and individuals, welcoming non-French participants and championing foreign ideas. Melding imaginative and political approaches to geography, the famous redrawn world map, The World in the Time of the Surrealists, that we see here, published in the Belgian journal Variété in June 1929, depicted seismic disruptions of countries and continents and left Paris as just a last outpost on the edge of the world. And we'll notice here that Czechoslovakia and Prague don't actually get to make it to this map at all. It's still the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The question of the international increasingly characterized surrealist activities during the 1930s, a decade that saw the emergence of new groups around the world, each with its own distinct priorities added to shared core values. The inauguration of international surrealist exhibitions, a triple-page spread in Minotaur documenting publications from 18 countries, and the inauguration of 4 bilingual international surrealist bulletins between 1935 and 36, each issued in a different country, and in which the proliferation of surrealist activity was a recurring motif. In this manner, surrealism explicitly aimed to establish an understanding beyond the insularity of national identities and local dialogues. This proclamation of a realm beyond borders and boundaries, embracing a mental as much as material freedom, is expressed by Breton's claim for the limits, not frontiers, of surrealism, as he titled his speech. Surrealism, he announced, tends to unify the aspirations of the writers and artists of all countries. This unification, far from being simply a unification of style, corresponds to a new consciousness of life common to all. End quote. This challenge, connecting the political, the ethical, and the personal, is expressed again in the anonymous opening statement of the first issue of the International Bulletin of Surrealism in April 1935. This is a long quote, excuse me. Once surrealism located in the dialectical idea of the unity of the external world and the internal world, the means to even out the balance that is man in the face of the real world and of himself. Once he ceased to believe in the existence of a barrier between waking and sleep, between conscious and unconscious, between objectivity and subjectivity, how can he account for the frontiers that still separate nations and languages? The human psyche is international, just as the conditions of a perfect consciousness of the destiny and changes of the human individual are international. Now, significantly, issue 1 of the International Bulletin of Surrealism was published in Prague, and it marks the well-publicized visit of André and Jacqueline Breton and poet Paul Éluard to Prague, during which Breton gave a series of important lectures and interviews outlining surrealism's aspirations, particularly its hopes for revolutionary social change. Here in Prague, these ideas could be warmly received, whereas by 1935, surrealists in Paris had hit a brick wall in their attempts to make common cause with party communism. The Czech Communist Party was still open to dialogue with independent artists and intellectuals, though positions would harden in the next few years. It was Breton's only visit, but the memory would stay with him of Prague as, in his words, the magic capital of old Europe. Above all, the bulletin celebrated the successful launch the previous year of the Czechoslovak Surrealist group, made up of writers, artists and practitioners from the realms of theatre and music. It was the energetic poet Vítězslav Nezval who initiated this move, having met surrealists in Paris, and then published the manifesto Surrealism in Czechoslovakia, co-signed by another 10 members, including artists Jindřich Štěrský and Twain, poet Konstantin Bíbl, and psychoanalyst Bohuslav Bruk. And writer, architecture theorist, artist and graphic designer Karel Tiger, arguably the leading Czech intellectual of the interwar, would join the new group soon afterwards. What's significant, though, is the extent to which this new addition to the constellation of the international movement had not merely imported surrealism's principles ready-made, and indeed that from the start there'd be key precepts from Paris about which Prague collaborators felt distinctly lukewarm, notably the first manifesto's emphasis on the centrality of psychic automatism. Recognizing in French surrealism a striking practical and poetic affinity with their own developing ideas, Czechoslovak surrealists had come to this logical and necessary next step through more than a decade of their own sustained research in the experience and legacies of the diverged group that between 1920 and 1932 represented the most progressive avant-garde tendency in Czechoslovakia, a broad coalition of participants across the whole spectrum of the creative arts. Open to Marxist-Leninist positions coming from Moscow and Berlin, channeling the optimism of the newly formed state of Czechoslovakia, Diverged was also motivated by a fascination with the modern urban environment, popular culture, especially film, and a playful attitude to the poetry of everyday life. Ancestors claimed by Parisian surrealists were also cherished by diverged, notably the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who'd first coined the word surrealism and whose links to Prague made his poetry a touchstone for the Czechs. Tiger had been a central figure in diverged, and in particular he helped conceptualize the work of the group's leading artists, Szczerski and Toyen. Having lived in Paris during the late 1920s, together they had helped formulate two distinct trends, spawned within diverged, but both pointing a path towards surrealism. Poetism, the lyrical celebration of chance, humour and the ephemeral in the everyday, and its further development in artificialism, in which the artists explored organic, dream-infused environments that would steer the direction of the Czechoslovak surrealist group as it developed a characteristic momentum from the 1930s onwards. As you would have anticipated, this flourishing would be short-lived. With the threat of invasion growing as the decade progressed, Germany effectively dismantled and annexed Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Over the years of the Second World War, a period of violent and mortal oppression effectively curtailed any possibility of continued surrealist activity. The group had already begun to splinter in the late 1930s in the face of current events, and Szczerski died in 1942. Obliged to cease all but the most private expressions, what the remaining surrealists couldn't have anticipated was that this was just the beginning of a prolonged period of repression and restriction, no less than 5 decades in all, during the majority of which surrealist activity could only be carried out in circumspect and clandestine conditions, with surveillance, censorship and possible imprisonment a present threat for all but brief moments between 1939 and 1989. So what seems extraordinary in retrospect is not just that surrealism in Czechoslovakia managed to survive, but it found the means to grasp and adapt to these negative conditions in order to produce not just individual works, but a collective and distinctive identity and energy, even though they were all but cut off from news and dialogue with the contemporary international surrealist groups. During the war, while Tiger kept making small-scale collages around themes of landscape, architecture and the erotic body, poet and artist Jindřich Hiesler managed to develop a practice of staged and manipulated photographs, even while spending most of the war in hiding in Toyen's flat, for fear that his Jewish identity would be discovered. Unexpectedly, in these circumstances, towards the end of the war, not one but 2 artists' groups identifying strongly with surrealism emerged and endured, Skupina 42 and the Ra group. A few of their members, which included photographers and writers as well as painters, would help to reformulate the surrealist group around Tiger at the end of the decade. In the brief hiatus between the liberation and the imposition of severe new restrictions with the communist seizure of power in 1948, Toyen and Hiesler had emigrated to Paris. 1951, most likely as a result of pressure from his public denunciation as a counter-revolutionary. But around the leadership of writer, theorist and playwright Bratislav Effenberger, the surrealist circle, comprising artists, writers and photographers, grew and endured. Throughout the 1950s, much of the 1960s and beyond, their opportunities for publication and exhibition, at home or abroad, were slim, and samizdat editions, private group meetings or studio visits, and the creation of one-off typewritten almanacs passed from hand to hand were the main avenues for collective expression, even as the group's theoretical positions in the face of these political and social circumstances continued to evolve. This historical context is important for an understanding of the trajectory of Czechoslovak surrealism in comparison to its Parisian forms, and especially once we come to look at individual works by Czechoslovak surrealists themselves. But I'd also like to argue that it's visible above all in the special place held by photography, and in particular documentary photography, in this story. The documentary approach, we should remember, is just one of the strategies adopted by photographers aligned with surrealism, but it's one with a curious power to both show what's there and yet reveal what hasn't been seen, in a mode that can be active and critical at the same time. Writing in the early 1960s on the poetic charge of surrealist documentary photography in Czechoslovakia, Jan Krzyż noted how, quote, "It's become something unexpected, very mobile and changeable, eternally unsatisfied and always starting anew in an unlimited field of action." Film historian and theorist Elizabeth Cowie argues, meanwhile, that the documentary mode is ultimately concerned not only with the knowability of the world, but more specifically with that part of it which is presently unknown or coming to knowledge, that which cannot fully be grasped or represented. This renewed objectivity adjusts our own subjectivity in turn. As Cowie writes, "We address the documentary with our desire, demanding knowledge. It's a demand for identity." Somewhat neglected in early histories, since the late 1980s, the significance of photography as a surrealist practice has been increasingly highlighted in the scholarship of books and exhibitions. And photographers such as Man Ray, Brassai, Lee Miller and Claude Cahun are celebrated as leading contributors to the movement. But there's something special about the status of photography in Czechoslovak surrealist contexts. Not only are there a surprisingly large number of photographers to be discovered here, many of them unfamiliar to wider audiences, but unlike their counterparts in Paris, who enjoyed a cordial but strongly independent relationship to the group around Breton, those in Czechoslovakia often maintained a much closer alignment with the movement, in many cases clearly identifying as surrealist practitioners. This is especially the case for the individual first responsible for making photography a central concern for Czechoslovakian surrealism, Jindřich Štýrský. Active as a graphic artist, publishing designer and theatre designer, Štýrský is best known as a painter. In his surrealist phase, his work explores unexpected, troubling encounters in which memory, dream and eroticism erode the boundaries between the natural and human realms, and in which materials and perspectives are defamiliarized. He'd been using a camera for several years in an amateur capacity, though some of his snapshots started to take on a more concentrated, deliberate approach, such as a documentation in 1932 of his visits to Chateau Lacoste in the Vaucluse, former home of the Marquis de Sade. But in March 1934, as Ian Walker reveals in his perceptive account of Štýrský's photographs, apparently on the very same date as the formal founding of the Czechoslovak surrealist group, he and Nežval both purchased new professional-grade cameras, and Štýrský began seriously to make photographic images that would have a significant place in the history and legacies of his group. It's still unusual to come across Štýrský's works in books or exhibitions until fairly recently. He wasn't featured in the landmark show and catalogue L'amour fou that really put surrealist photography on the map in 1985, and nor indeed did that catalogue or exhibition include any other Czech practitioners. But Štýrský exhibited them prominently in Prague around the time they were made, to considerable acclaim. Despite being made over a very short space of time, between 1934 and 1935, and culminating in a remarkable book called On the Needles of These Days, which first came out in secret in 1941 and paired Štýrský's images with laconic poetic text by Hazler, these photographs both synthesize historic strands of surrealism's interest in the medium, but at the same time anticipate the approaches of post-war Czechoslovak surrealist photographers. One key characteristic of Štýrský's photography would become almost a standard for many of those who followed his lead: the interest in working with extended cycles of photographs rather than individual named images. More closely aligned to the use of photography as a documentary tool by scientists or social science than to fine art conventions, the cycle allows the maker to emphasize connections and narratives that could be imagined across groups of images, whether this might be generated by formal, thematic, or above all, poetic associations. The cycle affords a sense of a sustained body of work, of an open-ended archive as a deep research resource, less the singular lucky glance than an ever-open eye scrutinizing an undiscovered realm, tucked in the margins of the everyday world. Much as his photographs capture a personal vision, Štýrský would have been well aware of how they worked in dialogue with earlier practitioners. Above all, there's the legacy of the French photographer Eugène Atget, perhaps the definitive visual archivist of the geography of Paris, and whose systematic, objective intentions were nevertheless seized upon by first-generation surrealists as the revelation of a deep, neglected poetics of the city, in which empty streets, modern or outdated modes of commerce, were the banal jostles against the extraordinary, and above all, the meticulous and trained tactile detail of the city's materiality is all laid bare. We might imagine Štýrský playing at being the Atget of Prague, albeit one for whom the unexpected or the bereft always takes priority. While Atget used traditional glass negatives for ultra-high fidelity, Štýrský in turn used a medium format camera, as did quite a few of the later Czech surrealist photographers, generating a square format that gives the results crisp detail, but must also have added to their adaptability as a playful, mobile sequence once sets of individual images are laid out on a table and shuffled around. Like so often for Atget in Paris, it's Prague's neglected street corners or curious shop displays that catch Štýrský's eye. But there are also unexpected decorative or sculptural details of buildings and urban environments, automata and the paraphernalia of popular culture. banal advertising texts that speak of surreptitious desires, and ambivalent echoes of the human body in mannequins or outdated painted images. The photo cycle of On the Needles of these days showcased pictures of cemeteries, flea markets, cafes or shop windows that work as hidden signs with both an explicit familiar meaning and one that's waiting to be deciphered. Nezval's poem The Dark City of 1935, one of many pieces of writing born of his devotion as a Prague flaneur, carries a similar evocation of spaces and structures drifting into dreamscape. I entered the dark city, a city guarded behind walls. Its northern gate was like the Trojan horse, a city like a carousel. I wandered down a street shaped like a zeppelin, a street with houses like soft hangars, with houses like accordions, and suddenly a strange house leapt before me, a house like a top hat on springs. Out of windows, gorgeous women winked at me, and there were other streets composed of beds, and others of suitcases, and somewhere a stylish jukebox. Where Ajay almost always captures his scene from a careful, judicious vantage point with his cumbersome camera and tripod so as to take everything in. With his cycles, Ściersky sometimes stands square to his subjects, but at other times takes oblique shots, looks high, glimpses a detail, peers into grubby shadows, subtly disrupting the continuity of vision. In its book form, as Ian Walker observes, Hiesler's texts work to further unsettle the viewer's ability to evaluate their status, sometimes complementing, sometimes perverting our reading of the images. Several privileged locations for Ściersky's cycles connect to a wider history of surrealist photography. We've noted the attraction of junk shops and flea markets of the kind you can still find now and again in Prague today, with their heaps of dilapidated possessions and unnameable trinkets mixing treasure and trash. But such places are, of course, also an obligatory stop-off for the French surrealist flaneur, and celebrated as well as photographed in Platon's books Nadja and Mad Love. One abiding theme, pursued on the outskirts of Prague or the rural towns of Bohemia, is the iconography of traditional travelling fairs, with their charming folk paintings advertising entertainment. An interest in popular culture environments shared once again with the Parisian surrealists, but also harking back to themes dear to diverged poets and artists. Caught as they were between the present and the past, the poetry of popular culture is a subject that would remain somewhere in the Czech surrealist unconscious for some time to come, even as its resonance gradually slips into nostalgia. The 1953 photograph that you see on the right here, of a corner of a rural fun fair called Lost Entertainers by Eva Fulkova, who wasn't herself a member of the Czechoslovak surrealist group, but whose background was in the Skupina 42 circle, picks up this same subject once again, but now its specificity in historical time feels short-circuited. The invitation to an old-fashioned happy zone for children, vesele personal, countered by the authority of a modern loudspeaker form. It's as if each promise comes with a reminder. Past and future happiness has its price in the missing present. Finally, and anticipating an increasingly significant theme for future Czechoslovak surrealists, in some less well-known images we find Ściersky looking, with what I read as a kind of puzzlement, at spaces and materials whose structures are fuzzy or collapsing. Details of mottled walls, broken objects, small piles of rubbish. We might surmise these are personal visual records made for his paintings. That was the case, for instance, with his strange images of tree roots. But there's something more going on here, especially when we know that Nezval, whose photographic skills were altogether less adept, took photographs in the same kinds of urban environments as Ściersky, but also devoted attention to photographing rubbish tips, rag and bone yards, and piles of discarded things. And I'm sorry not to have an image to show you, but they're kind of very amateurish photographs of kind of border areas outside of cities and piles of rubbish and rubbish tips. A tiny text by Nezval, one of 43 very short poems that make up the 1937 sequence Bizarre Town, has this vision of treasure and anxiety to offer. In the scrap heap, where dominoes glitter, walks a preoccupied child, counting from 1 to 100. Just as Ajay, that painstaking documenter of Paris, didn't neglect to explore the no man's land of the zone just outside the city boundaries, with its edgeland landscapes, migrant inhabitants, and marginal economies, so Nezval and Ściersky can be seen working through the idea of a zone and extending its indeterminacy from periphery back to a centre that is now itself nothing but in between. Made in very different circumstances, this vision of a liminal city would be a defining strategy for the next generation of Czech surrealist photographers. One can glean a sense of just how different Ściersky and Nezval's vision of Prague might be from a glance at the portrayal of the city somewhere around the 1940s by another prolific documenter of Czechoslovakia in this era, Karel Plička, whose photographs convey much of the allure and baroque grandeur of eerie magic, in compositions that step back to take in scenic vistas a bit like a visiting tourist. And I have to confess, it was a book about Prague by Plička that was on my parents' bookshelf first, with my first kind of fascination with Prague as a place to visit. But by the 1940s, the atmospheric charge of Prague, the emotion behind the monument's facade and shop windows, had shifted dramatically. The loose group of writers, artists, and a photographer in Skupina 42, formalising their collective activity at precisely the worst moment, midway through the year, the war, turned their attention once again to the material and everyday experience of the contemporary urban environment. In the words of historian Jan Mrčoch, they were not interested in the royal glossiness of Prague and its heritage of the past centuries. On the contrary, they were exploiting the wrong side of urban life, untidy apartment blocks of the suburbs with forgotten objects, reminding one of petty human everyday dramas. Skupina 42 tended to acknowledge surrealism rather than proclaim it explicitly. After all, this would have been a dangerous moment to do so. But in the 1940s, images of photographer Miroslav Hák, whose work spans the 1930s to the 60s and takes in a far wider array of techniques and approaches than Ściersky, the latent disintegration of the urban scene that we find in Ściersky's 1930s images, the anxiety and looming despair they kept hinting towards, now comes to the forefront, mixed with a premonition that the only way out might be to seek out those banal scenes in which all the important meanings have been pushed below surface appearances. As we follow Hák's wartime work, and mindful of the extent to which Prague would have been a policed zone at this time, subject to hostile observations and curfews, you get the sense of a furtive snatching of images wherever they can be found, preferably where Hák couldn't be seen by others, in gaps between buildings or in silent courtyards, in quiet suburbs, in spaces behind public premises, and especially on the outer margins. Behind the city, as the title of one image has it. Now and again, aspects of modernity in its most ubiquitous forms are the alibi for an image. Telegraph wires, petrol stations, tram terminals. Just as prevalent are the signs of neglect or collapse, and like Ściersky before him and other surrealist photographers later, the dilapidated textures and sullen marks of old walls are scrutinised for messages. There's not always time in Hák's work for the niceties of composition or for lining everything up perfectly, but every now and again he comes across a devastating coincidence. In the courtyard finds a gloomy interior corner of a neglected apartment building, lit by a milky light in which the distressed walls and crumbling cobblestones have a medieval air. A large, rough wooden handcart looms from the corner, and from a chain between its shafts hangs a woman's dress, presumably put there to dry, but the crumpled state of the patterned fabric implies otherwise, that the garment has been hastily discarded, and that, as the viewer can't help reflecting, the owner has fled, or worse. A dismal rag perched on the handle, an ominous smudge on the floor beneath the dress, give this image a portent of unspoken disappearances and off-stage violence. Davička Terminus dramatises this loss even further, taken in a rather drab quarter in Prague behind the castle that's now a busy suburb, but at the time would have started to mark the edges of the city. Looking through the open door of what appears to be an abandoned train carriage, strap hangers swaying in the breeze, we see the messy rubble of a collapsing building, and behind that again the chimneys of an anonymous factory, whose continuation above the roof of the train suggests that the two objects have been surreptitiously fused together. Nothing about this environment can quite be placed, yet put together, missing passengers, obscure technical operations, terminal destinations, with our retrospective historical knowledge, it all pushes the onlooker into fearing the worst. The calamity of the war's impact on European urban populations and environment is made more explicit still in a cycle of photographs taken in the Moravian city of Brno by another photographer with a background in surrealist collective activity, Wilhelm Reichmann. Reichmann, whose family background was German, had been enrolled in the German army in 1942, but he deserted and joined the Soviet army, ending the war in a prison camp. Having known Nezval during the 1930s, he joined the Ra group of artists, whose activities after the war included links to the short-lived dissident revolutionary surrealism movement based in Belgium and France towards the end of the 1940s. Reichmann's photographs in his first major cycle, Wounded City, taken in Brno between around 1945 and 1947, documented the destruction Allied bombardment in the final years of the war had inflicted upon the material and cultural fabric of the urban environment, one whose disfigured body stood for all its apparently absent inhabitants, over 1,000 of whom had died as a result, as the camera sought out collapsed structures, broken objects, the scarification of bomb shrapnel or sniper fire on the skin of the city. As testimony of the entropic landscape around them, the experience of surrealists living in cities such as Brno, Prague, Belgrade or Bucharest was thus radically different to that of their colleagues in Paris, New York or Mexico City. But these photographs do bear comparison to Lee Miller's far better known series of images of the London Blitz, the 1941 book Grim Glory. What's telling in Reichmann's sequence, however, is the date range. The photographs in Wounded City were all taken not during the hostilities themselves, but after the war, as though these were wounds that might take years to heal, if at all, as indeed characterised the painfully slow repair of ruined cities across Central and Eastern Europe following the V-Day, where Miller had a distinct task to achieve, to bear witness to the onslaught, but also to wring pathos and resilience from it, sometimes at the cost of some chirpy irony in the Blitz spirit tradition. Reichmann's homeless gaze finds less cause for ready conclusions or sentiment, including, for example, the fact that most of this destruction had been the result of Allied bombardment rather than Germans. In 1961, fellow photographer and RA member Václav Zygmunt would write of this cycle that, quote, "Today we know that the wound of the city, however serious, however fatal, was finally healed. Man is eternally restoring the broken, eternally returning to where there's no place to return in his activity and his desire for indestructible happiness and peace." End quote. But there's not much in the images themselves to authorise such retro-optimism. Materials are tortured and wrecked, signs of communication channels negated, the hope that might have brought communities together, for instance in the form of the figure of Christ, are all blasted away. Reichmann himself, who'd worked up until this point as a caricature artist, would nonetheless make a claim for a dark humour driving these works that could give them a critical rather than fatalistic charge. The grotesqueness of the shots, the starkness of the contradictions that I capture, the random element of laughter mixed with an optimistic nod to life, unsentimental reality, an overwhelming and monstrous exaggeration of genuine reality, its small, seemingly insignificant things, their promotion to an event equal to the whole of human life, to something fundamental, superior, generalizable. All of this means incorporating the methods of caricature into the field of photography. In other words, to use the principle of art criticism, even in the area where so far only photomontage could be an effective political weapon. End quote. Subsequent cycles around themes such as metamorphosis, couple, or magic were pursued until the 1980s, with Reichmann a prolific and significant photographer in this era. Though not a participant in subsequent collective activity, his attitudes and subject matter bring him close to the concerns of post-war Czechoslovak himself from its theoretical framework. Was this indeed still surrealism, or rather instead perhaps a new horizon of the real? As another RA colleague, Ludwig Kundera, would write to Reichmann a couple of years later, quote, "To wander through the thickets of towns and the structures of nature without a compass leads to unexpected encounters, discoveries of the seamy side of reality. It means to admit, step by step, the multiformity, in short, the richness of reality to consciousness." Asked in an interview what his credo as a photographer might be, Reichmann's response was that credo was, quote, "too pompous a word for my taste. I like the word dream, but I don't know how to use it in this context. Experience has also taught me to expect favourable coincidences. This attitude, though irrational, disappointed me the least in life and in humour. I was finding rather than inventing. I preferred the game to the concept." Irrational attitudes, finding rather than imagining or dreaming, choosing the path of least disappointment. Something detonated by the years of conflict and occupation, something specific to the Czechoslovak surrealist experience, and at the very least, something quite distinct from the experience of those surrealists who saw out the war in France or the Americas, has together switched the points and shifted tracks. Even if in France the balance of intellectual power had tilted towards existentialism and communist orthodoxy, post-war surrealism in Paris continued to enjoy a prominent, if reduced, public profile once a group had reconnected in May 1946. And during the next decade or so, France continued and extended many of along with a staunch, non-aligned political activism. In contrast, Surrealist writers and artists gathering around first Tiger and then Effenberger in 1950s Prague found themselves faced with quite different, more volatile priorities, constraints. To them, the urgent research now needed to focus not on the utopian promises of the imagination, but the concrete, brute actuality of everyday spaces and circumstances, under severe restriction. As such, the very constituent bases of Surrealist theory and practice were now in need of re-evaluation. It's a dynamic captured well by Petr Král, a group member of the 1960s and author of the first major study of Surrealist photography. I'm quoting Král now. Far from developing Surrealism in its canonical form, post-war Czech Surrealism sought to renew and radically rethink it, all the more inventively since the war and its consequences had cast doubts for them on many of its aspects. The experience of the so-called post-revolutionary regime had the effect of accelerating still more the revision process, where pre-war Surrealism was motivated by the hope for a radical change in the world and its decisive humanization. Its Czech inheritors sought to prolong its vitality without keeping its romanticism, in order to tie it, on the contrary, to a more profound sense of the real. Deflected from the utopia of a world attuned to desire, their imagination turned to the present and its daily realities, so as to become the instrument of their critique. End quote. As we've seen, this turn to everyday actuality, in all its deceptive banality, but also in all its hidden or repressed messages, was already visible in Czechoslovak surrealist photography since the 1930s. But during and after the war, it became the central focus for an extended photographic practice that has continued in the Prague group to this day, forming a remarkably coherent and tight-knit tradition of critical documentary image-making. Within this unbroken line of inquiry is that of Emila Medkova. Medkova trained in the photography department at the Prague School of Graphic Arts during the war, where she encountered figures from photography's avant-garde. It's also where she met her future husband, painter Mikoláš Medek, himself a leading figure in post-war Czech art. Together, the Medeks met and joined Tiger's surreptitiously reformed Surrealist circle. Though they would distance themselves from it for a few years in the early 1970s, Medkova would otherwise remain a central and important participant in this group from 1951 up to her death in 1985. Ironically enough, it's her earliest works, made largely before being integrated into the Surrealist movement, that at first sight look the most surreal. Staged photographs, sometimes made in partnership with Medek, that organised found objects, private spaces, and shadowy human forms. Dreamy and hostile at the same time, they resemble dramatic recreations of nightmares, pitting subjects and objects in a war for supremacy, or exploring the anxious metamorphoses of everyday articles. But it seems to have been the collaborative debates emerging from the reformed Surrealist group that impelled Medkova to turn her camera instead to places where absurd juxtapositions could be found rather than invented, in the outside world. For the Surrealists facing the climate of 1950s Czechoslovakia, where ordinary life could be ruled by brusque reversals of value and meaning, the real world of physical objects and spaces imposed itself as the only valid and relevant theatre of action, in which the idea of poetry might retain some critical force. Answering the group's internal inquiry on Surrealism in 1953, the Medek's joint response made this position very clear. We think that concrete irrationality and the irrational concrete are the prerequisites for modern authentic poetry and a modern feeling about life. This reality is a space within which the whole of the world's systematized chaos is reflected. It's not possible to bargain with that reality. Any poetry that bargains and haggles with that reality, be it in the name of humanity or beauty, is not poetry in its full authenticity. The habitats Medkova would document, and the social reality her work confronted, became this here and now of the everyday environment around her. And from the early 1950s, she began to haunt specific districts of Prague, such as Libyan and Karlin, working with a large format camera to capture elevations and details of street scenes or patches of no man's land, gradually getting in ever closer to interrogate every fissure and stain on the surface of the built environment. Looking back from the perspective of the 1970s, the group's de facto leader, Effenberger, gauged what had changed from French Surrealism's ambitions to contemporary Czech prerogatives. "I wasn't willing to swear on the dogma of liberty, love, and poetry," he wrote. "This utopian maxim could only have muted everything that still blazed within Surrealism. The streets in which Surrealists were looking for the marvellous had changed between the wars and from the 1940s. It was a different irrationality that I'd encountered there. This irrationality, produced by a decadent rationality, burst with a humour so objective that all you had to do was place it in front of a camera or on a stage for its rationalist shell to crack open and a purifying sarcasm to leap out." This is the bitter laughter we find in much of Medkova's work of the 1950s, though it also uncovers a world of ghostly or uncanny hauntings in the fabric of streets and buildings, and a kind of incipient anthropomorphism, except that here the implication is that it's human beings that are starting to resemble concrete objects and structures, not the other way around. Her photographic cycles home in on the eerie or occult repetitions of significant numbers, or the phenomenon of closure, where all attempts to repress or negate history, meanings, or customs inevitably fail. Once again, the cycle format encourages the viewing of these works as serial archives, as research materials that gather momentum and dialogue in their collective impact. As the decade advanced, Medkova was also drawn to apparently almost entirely abstract spaces and surfaces, continuing a theme Styrskian had explored, but also joining a dialogue with her husband's work, where reading the knots, accidents, and borders of a wall, for example, could be to perform a kind of scrying, a critical divination of the world's meanings through its resistant debris. In the late 1950s, these themes were taken up obsessively by a younger recruit to Surrealist circles, Alois Nožička, though his first images were taken seemingly without knowledge of the movement. Moving ever closer to his subject matter, investigating unobserved details in decrepit built structures, their secret connections in eroding materials, as though through a laboratory microscope, Nožička's photographs suggest, if anything, an even more despairing view of an urban culture in which every product of technology or economy is destined to collapse, or is corroded from within by cancerous tumours against which even the inoculation of black humour is little reprieve. Subsequent cycles took him to wastelands and rubbish tips, turning the lens downwards to find forlorn detritus and abandoned, unnameable objects. It would be a few years yet before Surrealists in Paris would start to articulate a critique of post-war consumer society. Here in Prague, but in the context of a socialist state, Nožička's images already seem to foreclose any possibility of grasping today's goods and economies. As, in Elena Nadvornikova's words, ghostly being objects, they're already on the scrap heap and rotting into fantastic cadavers. Looking back, we can see the recurring themes across all of these bodies of work through 2.5 decades. Above all, interrogations of spaces and objects in order to disrupt the conventions and assumptions they'd been used to support. Images of signals and signs in order to break apart ideological languages and codes, and the collapse of structures into formlessness as a radical subjectivity floods into these gaps in signification. These are all signs of the eruption of a surrealist counter-meaning within the policing of the everyday, something that Christopher Noheden has termed the speculative objectivity that characterises surrealist documentary photography, and that gives its manifestations in Czechoslovakia special pertinence. So this is where my time frame and my allotted time this evening draws to a close. But I'd just like to briefly indicate that this tradition in Czechoslovakian surrealist documentary photography, so distinct from currents elsewhere in the world, as surrealist practice and research continued to develop into the late 20th century, has both endured and evolved. For those in the group around Effenberger, the short-lived liberalisation of the Czechoslovak state in the mid-1960s was brought to yet another end with the Soviet-led invasion of 1968. But in the interim, the tentative openings for activity included renewed contact with the Paris surrealists, who staged their exhibition The Pleasure Principle in Prague and other Czech cities earlier that year. Restricted but significant communication with international colleagues and overseas opportunities for exhibiting and publishing were somehow maintained up until the Velvet Revolution of 1989, that finally permitted unrestricted public activity. Since this date, the group has kept up a sustained profile, making it arguably the most active surrealist group of recent years, even as it retains its position as a critical outsider to mainstream culture, but pursuing activities including exhibitions, events, television broadcasts, and a major journal, Analogon, that to date has reached an astounding 103rd issue. The pages of Analogon are the plainest evidence that documentary photography continues to be a critical and playful research tool for today's Czechoslovak group, whether to witness collective games and to offer a psychogeography of edgelands and suburbs, or to provide a critical framework for understanding the eruptions of the irrational that haunt capitalist Czechia as much as they ever did communist Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovak surrealism, as perhaps nowhere else, documentary photography's search for a rediscovered, reclassified knowledge of the everyday world is pursued with an intimate abandon.